Before I introduce our next speaker, I want to tell you something about Jewish law. You know that we count 613 commandments, but there is now one additional commandment, number 614, issued by Dr. Sharon Alroy Price, who is the head of public health services, and she warmly recommends that everybody wears a mask in a closed area. So if it is not too great an imposition, please. I would like now to introduce Professor Nicolai Sinai, who received his PhD from the Freie Universität in Berlin. There are some rumors that Professor Neuwirth was somehow involved in this, and he is now Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Pembroke College. His publications include the Qur'ān, a historical critical introduction, and Raingiver, Bonebreaker, Score Settler, Allah in pre-Quranic poetry, and he has just edited a volume entitled Unlocking the Medinan Quran. But today he will speak to us about Meccan Quran. Please, Professor Sinai.
Thank you. I'm privileged and honored to be here. Thanks to Professor Yohanan Friedmann, to Siva Deckel and Sima Daniel for certainly getting me and everybody else safely here. The last time I think I had a chance to address this convention was when I was moving house, and I was, I think, literally sat on a removal box and talking from the screen, so I'm grateful to have been asked back in person. Am I speaking into the microphone as I... Okay, I'm getting really self-conscious about that. Great. So there's a lengthy paper of some 20 pages that I submitted as instructed. I'm not sure whether people actually made it through those papers. I certainly didn't manage to read all of them, so I rather suspect you may not all have succeeded in doing that. But if you've got it on your devices, I thought what I might do is just sort of try to epitomize it and go through it in a fairly sort of improvised manner and skip some of the more technical references and footnotes. If you're interested in all the disclaimers, they are there, and maybe it might be useful to sort of follow along as I try to sort of summarize the things I'm trying to say there. I mean, it's obvious, I think, by now. I think we've known that since 1833, when Abraham Geiger published his groundbreaking monograph. It's obvious that the Quran is intimately in conversation with Jewish and Christian sources. It used to be a pastime of late 19th and early 20th century scholars to try to work out whether Judaism or Christianity was more fundamentally important to the milieu of the Quran. So there are book titles that lean in one direction or the other. Abraham Geiger's, God, I call him Adam Geiger. Oh, yeah, maybe you shouldn't read along that that draft paper. Anyway, what has Muhammad borrowed from Judaism? On the Christian side, you get people like Tor Andre or Bell, who've both got books that have the origin of Islam and Christianity in the title. That has fallen a bit out of fashion, of course, but it's not inherently an improper kind of question to ask, whether we can sort of pinpoint distinctively Jewish or distinctively Christian, whatever that might mean, traditions and ideas in the Quran. And in some cases, I think that has actually been successfully shown. There's that famous instance of a quasi-quotation of the Mishnah in Surah 5. So that's certainly not generically Abrahamic. That is distinctively one thing rather than another. In recent scholarship, I think there's been a tendency to accentuate the importance of Syriac Christian traditions. So Joseph Whitstone, for instance, unfortunately isn't here, very disappointing. I think he's in Princeton, enjoying himself. Scholars like him, Gabriel Reynolds, have stressed the significance of Christian traditions, but that hasn't really been coupled with the assumption that therefore rabbinic parallels are inadmissible. I think what seems to be the prevailing common sense now is a sort of very flexible background paradigm where sort of any compelling parallel is allowed to stand, but the default assumption would be that for the Meccan surahs maybe Christian traditions are more important, and for the Medinan surahs, we do get more precise engagement with rabbinic traditions. And I think that is borne out by the Quran itself. So there's some interesting cases, for instance, of Arabic Hebrew punning in the Medinan surahs that I think presuppose that there was people around who had some knowledge of Hebrew. Now, this whole debate over Christianity versus Judaism, I think, certainly for me, has received a new impetus by a forthcoming article by Holger Zellentin. So he draws attention to a number of statements in the Meccan surahs, so the older part of the Quran, that seem to presuppose that there was concrete on-the-ground interaction with contemporary Israelites, Banu Israel. It's a point that Patricia Kroner has made in passing, and Holger develops it. I guess I'm eating humble pie because for a long time I sort of resisted that paper, but I think he's probably right in one respect at least. So I'm publicly saying that. Maybe the most impressive, or one of the two most impressive statements that he latches onto comes towards the end of Surah 26, Shu'ara, so Meccan, classic Meccan. There's a statement that says that that's one of those free-floating pronouns in the Quran. It could be this revelation or the preceding, is contained in the writings of the ancients. And then the next verse states that the learned ones among the Israelites know it. And يَعْلَمَهُ عُلَمَاءُ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل. So it seems that there were certain Israelites in the environment who were apt, could be relied upon to confirm aspects of what had just been relayed. Another verse that I think points us in a similar direction, Surah 46:10, Muhammad only conveys what is relayed to him by revelation. And then there's an accusation, you, second person plural, repudiate it, you disbelieve in it. Whereas a witness from among the Israelites bears testimony to something like it. Shahida shahidun min bani Israel ala mithlihi. And so I think the use of the singular here is striking. I mean, I think an argument could be made that a passage like that, in order to be rhetorically effective, I mean, if we assume it to have addressed the contemporaries of Muhammad, that it presupposes that there was an individual Israelite, possibly known by name, who held views similar to what has just been said. So my temptation in the past has been to dismiss most of that as kind of very optimistic rhetorical extrapolation, but I think if one does face up to these verses, I think it's difficult to disagree that there is an assumption here that there are Israelites in the environment. There's a couple of other verses that I go through in the written paper that I'm not going to go in here, but it all sort of adds up, I think, to Holger's point that some on-the-ground concrete interactions with Israelite individuals seem to be sort of attested to by the Meccan surahs. So before progressing to the main argument, maybe two subsidiary points. First, a chronological observation, looking at the passages that I've just tried to summarize. At least two of them fall into the early Meccan surah, certainly by my dating, and there's some disagreement here, but I think it's fair to say if Holger's claim is correct that there is interactions, on-the-ground interactions with individual Israelites, and that will have held from very early on in the Meccan Quran's Genesis. The second subsidiary observation concerns, I guess, a disagreement between me and Holger. So who are these Israelites? Like, are they mainly Jews, or is it maybe a wider category that might even include or maybe primarily refer to Christians? Of course, in rabbinic literature, Yisrael, and that's the standard self-designation. Obviously, we have Himyarite inscriptions that also refer to the people of Israel, and the experts in the room can correct me, but the assumption seems to be that these are Jews, Israelites in the narrow sense. Holger does seem to feel very strongly that these could be Christians, and he points to the explicitly Israelite self-understanding that is cultivated by many latent Christians, and I think that's a valuable observation and important to bring to the table. I guess my own view on this would be predicated on the assumption that we do need to proceed mainly in terms of what the Quran itself tells us, because obviously there's all sorts of stuff circulating in the environment, which is very complex. So I don't really see any compelling evidence from within the Quran that contemporary Christians are Israelites according to the Quran. There's that famous verse at the end of Surah 61 about Jesus preaching to the Israelites that I think some people, including Patricia Kroner, see as evidence that the Quran would subsume Christians under the umbrella term Israelites. I'm not convinced. I go into that in the written paper. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So maybe just to sort of to mark my assumption here that I do think when the Quran says Banu Israel, I'd be inclined to interpret that to mean Jews rather than Jews and Christians or Jews and Jewish Christians or what have you. I'm coming to the end of the preliminaries. I think there's at least prima facie evidence that there's interaction with contemporary Israelites, i.e. Jews, in the Meccan surahs, and that then gives rise to the question, which is really the main question of the paper, whether there's any sort of specifically, distinctively Jewish, distinctively rabbinic motifs, concepts that we could pinpoint in the Meccan surahs that would then sort of cohere with the inference that there were at least individual Israelites in the Meccan environment. So it's easy enough to trace and track Jewish traditions in the Medinan surahs, as I've intimated. For the Meccan surahs, it's more difficult. It's not as in your face. So that's what I'll try to do. And my suggestion will be that what we might call a specifically Jewish imprint on the Meccan surahs is found primarily in relation to one of the two sort of doctrinal pillars of the Meccan Quran, so the idea of monotheism. I think Meccan eschatology does draw largely on Christian concepts and motifs, but when the Quran then begins to articulate its rigorous monotheism, I think there does seem to be a purposive, deliberate sort of retooling, harnessing of a limited number of rabbinic ideas. And this kind of general claim is, I think, in line with what is generally, I think, now the prevailing taste of Quranic scholars to stress that when the Quran appropriates an idea, it's normally done in a way that's doctrinally selective and deliberate. So ideas don't just end up in the Quran, they end up in the Quran because they play a certain function, they play a role, they're useful for saying something. So I guess I'm part of the mainstream in that regard. So what I think is my most compelling piece of evidence, I hope you would agree. If not, tell me, because I've got a book going to the typesetter next week, so this is the last opportunity to stop me. So the Quranic... Sorry? Hold the press. The Quranic concept of shirk. And this really goes back to, I think, a remark that Angelica made to me, I think, probably the last time I was in Jerusalem. She was in a conversation. She just meant, "Oh yeah," and Horowitz, obviously he realizes that shirk is shituf, and I think that's correct, and I'll try to add to that. But maybe sort of to take a step back. So shirk association, as I shall translate it, is the Quranic accusation that members of its environment are engaged in an illicit sort of partnering of God with other beings, false deities. It's a very complex idea. I couldn't possibly go into all of its ramifications. Gerald Horting and Patricia Kroner have done groundbreaking work on the concept, and a lot of that I think I'm deeply indebted to. I thought I'd simply give you a sort of a rundown of my own assumptions with regard to the idea of shirk. I think the participle ought to be translated as associator, so I'll stick to a very literal one rather than polytheist or idolater. I mean, I certainly don't think idolater is in any way warranted, so I mark students down for translating mushrik as idolater, and they still do it, but oh well, that's Oxford for you. I think Patricia is definitely on the money when she stresses, like a long line of previous scholars going back as far as, I think, at least Ibn Taymiyyah, that the Quranic associators did recognize the existence of a supreme creator deity who kind of sits above everything else. So in that sense, they are monotheists of a kind. The other deities are subordinate beings that play an intermediate sort of role. I do think, and that's, I guess, a disagreement with Patricia Kroner's work, that the associators were probably pagans rather than Jews or Christians or something else, largely because, anyway, I will go into it for the Q&A. And I think maybe more importantly to this talk, it's important to sort of bear in mind that the category of associationism, shirk, is an outside designation. It's a polemical label that the Quran sticks to its opponents. So I don't think we can imagine that those sort of 7th century Meccans going around identifying themselves as belonging to the Church of Associationism. I mean, this is a polemical label like kuffar, repudiators or unbelievers. So it's a Quranic category that the Quran deploys, which then raises the question of, where does the category come from? Where does the Quran maybe draw inspiration, or the author or the authors of the Quran? Where is the origin of this idea? There's not much in poetry. I mean, the root does crop up in poetry, but it just it means partnering or association in a secular sense. It doesn't play the role of a religious term. There's a fragmentary South Arabian inscription that I can't make a lot of sense of. So that was published in 1896 by Mortman and Miller, CIH 539. That seems to have a word that has been interpreted to mean shirk, and if the original translation of the editors is correct, it says something like, may he keep away shirk from a Lord who creates good and bad, if I remember correctly. I mean, I don't command Sabaic. I can sort of try to map it onto the transliteration. It seems very patchy to me. I haven't had much success in either finding more recent work on it or other occurrences, but I've just used the Jena Sabaic dictionary. There isn't much there. So if Professor Robin has any additions to make on that point, I'd be particularly grateful, because it would be important to sort of get clear about that. But it seems, if that's all we've got, then it seems to me a bit uncertain to posit a South Arabian origin of the notion. It's conceivable, but I don't know. Whether or not there's a Sabaic precedent, I think Horowitz is correct that the ultimate origin is likely Jewish. So Horowitz, in one of his characteristic two-line remarks that could become articles, he draws attention to the correspondence between Ashraka and Hebrew Shitef, or its Aramaic equivalents, Shautef. And in both cases, both in the Arabic and the Hebrew, of course, there's a noun corresponding, so we've got sharik and shutaf. So in Yuri-Rubin's modern translation, modern Hebrew translation of the Quran, for instance, the mushrikun become hameshatifim. I mean, I think that's a very plausible rendering to me. In light of that, I think very plausible proposal, what I then try to do is to just go through a selection of rabbinic occurrences to kind of see how that notion plays out in rabbinic literature. And obviously that's much easier now than it was at the time of Horowitz, because you've got the Bar-Ilan database, so you just enter the term and there you go. So there are two passages in the Babylonian Talmud that I think bear out the original claim of Horowitz. Whoever joins or Mishatef associates the heavenly name with something else shall be uprooted from the world. There's denials of God having associates in creation. The idea that God created Adam last so that people wouldn't say that he had an associate, a shutaf, in creation. I think that link between association and the power of creation is something we also find in the Quran. So there's, I think, enough material there to bear out Horowitz's suspicion. Some aspects of these statements are also found in Samaritan literature, but the Memar Marke seems difficult to date, so parts of it seem post-Islamic. You get the seal of the prophets in there too, unfortunately, in a section that the editor seems to feel is probably medieval rather than late antique. What I found interesting in sort of looking at these rabbinic occurrences of, I guess, shituf, shirk, is that the notion is much more sort of I guess, ambiguous, ambivalent than the Quranic one, because you also get references to God associating himself or his name with humans. So God associated his name with Israel. So that's an allusion to the etymology of Yisrael. God desired that he desired to make for himself a partnership with the beings below, and that then comes to fruition in the temple service. So the general idea that I take away from this, and the detailed references are in my paper, is that you cannot, as a human, you cannot associate yourself with God out of your own initiative, but God may well take the initiative and sort of promote humans to associate status, it being understood, obviously, that this is not ontological. So it's a notion that seems to cut more than one way. And what strikes me is that in the Quran, it's much more sort of unequivocally polemical. It's an instrument for dismissing this opposing theology that is represented by the associators. So there's a recalibration, I think a very palpable recalibration of a complex rabbinic notion into, I guess, an offensive weapon in the Quran. And then I do have a footnote saying, but please don't take me to say thereby that the Quranic God is therefore more distant and incapable of proximity with humans. I just think that happens elsewhere in the Quran. So it doesn't happen in this notion. The Quranic notion of shirk is a polemical recalibration of rabbinic shituf, but there is sort of proximity and interaction and closeness between God and humans in the Quran too, but that plays out in through a different terminology. So I thought that's a pretty strong case. We'll see. We can take a poll afterwards. The second one I'm not sure is quite as strong. The idea of God as a patron of the believers, God as the wali or as the maula of believers, which like the idea of shirk, starts fading into Quranic discourse round about the end of the early Meccan period. So again, chronological assumptions we can maybe set aside and discuss in the Q&A, because I'm aware not everybody likes to do chronology, but I do. So God as a wali or a maula of the believers is something that the Quran starts asserting from the end of the early Meccan period and then up until the Medinan surahs. It does seem likely that there was a social institution of sort of clientship, patronage in the environment of the Quran that is reflected by those statements. But I did find it striking to then discover that there does seem to be a distinct topos in Palestinian Jewish literature to call God a patron, patron. So it's basically they transcribe the Greek word. So there are two occurrences in the Jerusalem Talmud, nothing in the Babylonian one, and then there's another one in Genesis Rabbah, and a whole string of references in that collection of Jewish Palestinian Aramaic poetry that Sokolov and Yahalom edited in the late 1990s. So there's one poem that dramatizes the dispute between Nebuchadnezzar and the three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the refrain is, we have a patron, so we Israelites eat lan patron, who does not slumber or sleep. So God is the patron of the people of Israel. There's a poem on the 9th of Av that says that our patron was angry with us. And I think there's commonality here with the way the Quran uses the notion of patronage as applied to God. So in both cases, there's the assumption that sort of humans have, on the face of it, there's a whole range of patrons to which one could have recourse as a human. But in the end, I mean, when push comes to shove, it's really only God who could get you out of the lurch. When you're about to be thrown into a fiery pit, then you will know the difference between having God as a patron or something else. So the suggestion here would be then, rather than only theologizing a certain aspect of kind of the ancient Arabian social order, the Quran is perhaps also reflecting an earlier usage of this patronage motif in Abrahamic theology as found in these apparently Palestinian sources. I do wonder, and that's something else on which I'd like input, whether when Palestinian rabbinic texts speak about divine patronage, whether that's a dig at Christianity, because obviously saints are patrons too, and so maybe the idea, the subtext is that, you know, you Christians, you've got all these, I don't know, sort of subordinate saintly patrons, but we've got God as our patron. It wouldn't really change anything for the Quran. I'd just be interested to understand this notion more. So the argument so far would be that we've got Israelites on the ground. Professor Friedmann, when would you like me to draw to a close? I'm just trying to pace myself. Okay. Okay. If I take another 10, 15 minutes, would that? Okay, now I think I'll. Right. So we've got Israelites on the ground. I've proposed two, I think, specific concepts, motifs that, for which I think, you know, a rabbinic background is at least arguable. There's another one that maybe I'll just throw out here. It's something I've worked on a few years ago. It's that scene in Surah 10, which is sort of late Meccan, where Pharaoh drowns, and he tries to sort of get off the hook, and he recognizes God, and it doesn't work. There are rabbinic traditions who try to sort of illustrate the great power of repentance by showing that even somebody like Pharaoh, you know, if due to his repentance, he was saved, and he actually survived and went on to rule Nineveh. I mean, it's complicated because the traditions crop up in a later work, and you have to posit that there's earlier pre-Quranic traditions in a work that was finalized clearly in the early Islamic period. But if that seems acceptable for the moment, then that would be a third instance of where I think the Quran engages in a fairly specific manner with a particular kind of topic of rabbinic theology, that, you know, repentance is unconditionally effective. Even Pharaoh could sort of get himself out of the lurch by repenting in time. And the Quran disagrees. I mean, the Quran doesn't think that repentance is unconditional. You have to believe at the right time. You know, when God's punishment has finally started to sort of unfold, then that's it. I mean, you've lost your chance. So there again, there's sort of an engagement, I think, with something that seems identifiably rabbinic. I mean, we might get sort of cocky and sort of explore further more generic affinities. So I wonder whether the Quran's, I think, strikingly sort of relaxed attitude to sort of moderate anthropomorphism with regard to God. I mean, God has a hand, God sits down on a throne. It's all, I don't know, fairly measured, but I nonetheless do think that the Quran does envisage God as essentially a body. I do think that sort of reverberates more easily with rabbinic discourse than with Christian theology, but that would be an additional sort of idea to explore. I don't want to do that now. What I would like to do in the remainder of the paper is to maybe just make a few additional remarks on the stage at the kind of the moment, the evolutionary moment, if you will, at which these 2, 3, 4 rabbinic ideas kind of emerge into the bloodstream of Quranic discourse. So the transition from the early to the later Meccan surahs. Stylistically, I've argued that there's a sort of a conspicuous leap in mean verse length between the early and the Meccan surahs. Normally, that seems to have increased very organically over time, but that if you look at the graph, there's a leap, which I think is plausibly taken as a cutoff point between early and later Mecca. That coincides with some very interesting terminological discontinuities between the early and the later Meccan surahs. So the word deen in the sense of judgment, the Aramaic-derived sense of judgment, rather than the sort of ultimately Pahlavi-derived sense of religion. That is something early Meccan, and then the word seems to drop out of usage, and it comes back into Quranic discourse in the sense of religion at a later point in time. So deen is found, with a grain of salt. That seems to be deen in the sense of judgment is an early Meccan word. References to specifically Ism Rabbika, the name of your Lord, that doesn't come up in later surahs. So there's 1 or 2 cases where one might sort of argue whether they're early Meccan or not, but generally speaking, that too seems to be a terminological idiosyncrasy of the early Meccan surahs. Also, the notion of scripture. So in the early Meccan surahs, you find a heterogeneous range of different terms to refer to scripture: kitab, sohaf, zubur. In the later surahs, kitab then establishes a virtual sort of ascendancy, and scripture is only ever expressed by using kitab, and zabur or zubur becomes something much more sort of narrowly constrained. It seems to be associated with the figure of David in particular. One could go on. I mean, there's a number of very interesting discontinuities, and maybe just by way of a parenthesis, even somebody like Tommaso, who's much more skeptical of most things than I am. So in a recent piece of his last year, I mean, he does basically admit that there is an early Meccan corpus and that it's the earliest part of the Quran and that it is stylistically and lexically distinctive. He just thinks that that's where kind of Muhammad stopped, and the rest of the Quran is then post-prophetic. But there's a significant degree of agreement here between him and Nöldeke. I mean, to just admit that this is a coherent surah group and it's the earliest bit of the Quran, it's great to hear that we can join forces that far. Right. So. I've talked about a few stylistic and lexical sort of discontinuities between early and later Meccan surahs, and there's of course a momentous theological transition, which consists in the explicit affirmation of monotheism. So there's only one God. So the early Meccan surahs are mostly preoccupied with eschatology. They don't actually expressly deny that there's more than one God. I mean, God is a towering, sort of omnipotent, fearsome figure who will hold you to account and judge you at the end of days. But the early Meccan surahs don't actually say, and there's only one, and other deities whom you might think might be deities that don't exist. So that seems to emerge at a secondary moment in the Quran's genesis, in statements like at the beginning of Surah 37, Inna ilahakum lawahid. So explicit monotheism enters the scene. And then that becomes kind of arguably the main topic of the remainder of the Meccan surahs, kind of polemics about what monotheism means and whether worshipping certain beings amounts to violating it. So there's a monotheistic turn, one might say. And that's precisely the point at which the notions of shirk and also God as a Mawla and a Wali seem to sort of enter into Quranic discourse. I mean, those are two ways in which the Quran, in fact, articulates monotheism. So it seems that this sort of limited and sort of pinpointed usage of rabbinic motifs happened precisely at the moment at which the Quran theologically is moving on from eschatology, maybe even imminent eschatology into sort of explicit monotheism. And it's probably not a coincidence that, I mean, statements like Inna ilahakum lawahid, your God is one, there's 3 or 4 more in the early second Meccan surahs, that they're reminiscent of certain passages in the Old Testament, sort of, the Shema Israel, for instance, Deuteronomy 6:4. Obviously, Christians also read the Bible, but that particular verse in Deuteronomy is very prominent in the Jewish tradition. Now, I'm at pains to stress that my suggestion isn't that kind of the author or authors of the Quran chanced upon Jews who were reciting the Shema and therefore then picked up a taste for monotheism from that, and that's why we've got it in the Quran. I think there's sort of, or I try to tell a story that makes this understandable as an intelligible kind of progression of theological thought across the genesis of the Quran. And I imagine kind of the underlying sort of reconstruction one might put on it could go something like this. So there's this message of inevitable, maybe even imminent eschatology that is put forward very sort of impressively, with arousing rhetoric in the early Meccan surahs. A lot of people don't seem to have bought it, probably because they heard it before, old wives' tales and all of that. And then I think what's happening, or what the Quran attests to, is a reflection on why that might be. I mean, what are the causes for that seemingly unconquerable resistance, that sort of eschatological wall of doubt. And I think the analysis ultimately that comes through is that there's this sort of unfortunate, regrettable human tendency to always cling to hope in the face of kind of impending and inevitable doom. I mean, I think we can really identify with that, climate crisis and all of that. You just think it's going to be fine. So these people seem to have thought that, whatever happens, we've got these, intermediate deities that we can invoke, who will sort us, whatever life might throw our way. And I imagine that maybe in the first place, Quranic explicit monotheism is an attempt to sort of psychologically strip away these defenses in the face of the final judgment, to sort of drive home the message that really you are exclusively at the mercy of this judge. There's nothing else. So originally maybe the point of these explicit affirmations of monotheism wasn't so much to kind of make, I don't know, sort of a theological statement about the number of deities. I think it was sort of to combat this this tendency to seek a refuge with other beings who would assist you in some fashion or form. And I think that is where a sort of a pointed calibration of certain rabbinic notions was very useful to the Quran. I'm trying to wrap up now. I'm just trying to find the place I got up to. So the Quran, I think, draws on these ideas as congenial conceptual resources, supporting a certain train of theological thought, rather than just reflecting stuff that was around, because there was certainly more around that isn't reflected by the text. What does this mean? How does this sort of shed light on the historical environment of the Meccan surahs? Well, that's a bit of a problem, really. I mean, it's a problem for other reasons too. So, an argument that Tommaso, Guillaume D, and also Stephen Shoemaker, apparently in his most recent book, are really very fond of making now, is to say that, oh, we've got all this Christian stuff in the Meccan surahs, but there doesn't seem to have been organized Christianity in Mecca. Problem, we need to solve this, and then they go, wherever they go with that. So the Meccan milieu is a bit of an enigma. Should we imagine the Meccan milieu as one that was sort of in a hegemonically, sort of in a culturally hegemonic sense, sort of shaped by Judaism? I don't think so. I think there will have been individual Jews present, but I don't see Judaism as having the same sort of culturally dominant position as in the Medinan surahs. If you look at the Quranic onomasticon, so names, virtually all of them are either equidistant from Hebrew or Christian forms, or very distinctly Christian. I mean, in the paper, although I don't really do this kind of scholarship very well, but I'm not actually aware of any Quranic name that is closer to Hebrew than a Christian form of it. So if you can think of one, I'd try to, I'd love to correct that, but I couldn't. Even Banu Israel, of course, the syllable is that's not what you'd get from the Hebrew, which is Yisrael. I mean, there might be sort of morphological patterning, Israel, Ibrahim. There could be ways of pushing back against that, but I think it's still impressive that even the name Israel isn't taken from Hebrew, apparently. So I don't think Judaism was in any way sort of culturally dominant in Mecca. It must have been a presence. I mean, these motifs must have been available, and then they were ripe for the picking. Maybe that is not so different from what must have happened in South Arabia, where also it seems, if certainly Yvonne Gajda's work is kind of taken as a reference point, where it seems that there were local pressures that could be effectively addressed by drawing on the Jewish tradition. You needed a sort of some sort of unifying ideology for a multi-tribal, heterogeneous realm, and that's why it was useful to draw on Judaism. So it was the demand side that mattered rather than the supply side. I think that's probably also the case for the Meccan surahs. And that's it. Thank you.
Just to add to your list of words, names that are closer to Hebrew than to Christian.
It's a present, you can take that home.
Anything that with an initial hey, like Haman and Harun, I think is more likely to be close to Hebrew as opposed to Aman and Aaron.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that was actually a correction. You've phrased it very politely, but okay, thank you. Do you want to call upon people, or?
Does this thing work? Yeah, it works. Which one? Oh, that's intimidating. Okay, so thank you very much, Nicolai. It was a wonderful talk. Well, I will. You invited a question, and I'm happy to ask it. That as a first question, I will have some others. So who were the mushrikun?
Who
were the mushrikun then? So that's, yeah, that was your invitation. So then yeah. The other is, I think that Blois wrote on the Nasara, and I have a student who developed on this idea that the Nasara were actually not Christians, but the Nasara are what we tend to call Judeo-Christians, but my student thinks that it is a misnomer. They were actually Jews who lived in the area, including Mecca, and they were Jews who recognized Jesus as a prophet, and that would explain a lot of the doctrines why being between Jewish and Christian. So I would be very interested in your opinion on that, and then we can discuss it after. And yeah, so then I read, and something I fully agree with you on this sequence and the logic of the text. And when I read the text, I really see that a person behind it, and I really see it as speech, at least lots of it. And so there is someone who claims and believes that he's bringing the final message, not a new religion, but just the religion. He's talking about the religion, and then he expects those who are well off to recognize the ultimate source of their happiness and their mal wa awlad, things what he didn't have. The prophet, actually, he didn't have either of these, and then he's frustrated by the fact that they don't embrace his message. Which, on the other hand, well, the establishment doesn't really need change. So, if we are well off, why would we go with something new? So I fully understand your attitude of Halasiani. It's okay as it is, and then comes this frustration with them. And then yes, as you say, the response to their unresponsiveness to the message. So I think you are absolutely right on this.
Thank you. I mean, I'll try to be brief, and I don't think I've got anything really surprising to say in response to those questions. Certainly, who were the associators? I mean, I imagine they were just kind of, the Meccan majority who recognized that there was a creator God, but who were happy to sort of supplement him with kind of these quasi-saintly, quasi-angelic figures. I think they probably were very happy to sort of adopt monotheistic, I don't know, sort of Jewish Christian ideas that were floating around. The idea of intercession, for instance, that is very prominent in Christian discourse. So I could see the associators as being sort of, Arabian pagans. I don't know, 2+0, right, who sort of acquired additional ideas and maybe even practices from kind of the monotheistic religions that were gradually pressing in on them, because Christians were everywhere else, it seems. Of course, that's not a very, I'm not trying to be boring. I just find myself constantly sort of. It would be nice to have a more surprising answer to give, but I think that would be my answer. So I think syncretistic pagans. The Nasara, yeah, I mean, I'm aware of that claim. I do resist it. Maybe I'll come round, give me another couple of years. But there are those lists of religious communities, for instance, in Surah 2 and Surah 3, right? The Yahud and the Nasara and the Sabi'un, well, who knows who the Sabi'un are, and then the unbelievers and the Alladina Amanu. Well, the believers are clearly the Quranic community, so that's not a generic term, it's just this specific community of believers. And then you would kind of expect Christians to figure in that list. So if the Nasara aren't kind of mainstream Christians, then, who is? And I mean, there's clearly a lot of Christian material in the Quran. I don't think we could claim that the Quran is sort of ignorant of mainstream latent Christianity. I mean, there's just so much parallels in Ephraim and Jacob that you can assemble. So I do think it makes sense to assume that the Quran has a word for this particular religion, and in the absence of a better one, I think Nasara is it. But yeah, I recognize that that's a debate that's probably going to go on for a bit. And maybe just the term frustration that you've used. I mean, that is a plot. So I tend to always slightly try to resist overly psychologizing sort of descriptions of the development that is clearly going on. I think there will have been a psychological manifestation of it. Whoever is the author or the authors. I think Muhammad was the messenger. So clearly, things will have rubbed him one way or another. But I think it is important to me sort of to stress that the progression of ideas that I've tried to reconstruct is a theological movement of thought. It's not just kind of an irritable response to sort of a lack of success. I mean, there's a genuine difficulty here. Why do these people not take the message? That becomes a theological problem that then has to be addressed theologically, and that's where monotheism comes in. So I wouldn't discount the psychological kind of dimension of it, but I think there's also sort of a theological progression of ideas. So you weren't ruling that out, but I just wanted to add that.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you, Nicolai.
The mic.
Oh. This? Okay. Thank you, Nicolai. My observation is really a methodological one, and I want to introduce a distinction between a literary argument, which might include, it might also be called ideological and theological. So, analysis of language in the Quran on the one hand, and analysis of sort of history and what actually was happening on the ground on the other, and I would like to see more separation between those two types of analysis, and it seems to me that you and others fall into a certain trap, which is inevitable. You find evidence, obviously, for Jewish ideas, Christian ideas, and other ideas in surahs of the Quran that the Islamic tradition identifies as Meccan, but the Islamic sources, if I'm not mistaken, don't refer, later Islamic sources don't refer to Jews or Christians or others except for pagans and polytheists in Mecca itself. So then the problem is, how do I explain the presence of Jewish ideas in a city during a 10-year period when, according to Islamic sources, there weren't any Jews or Christians in those cities? And so what really kind of bothers me is just the use of is Mecca and Medina. And what do you mean when you say Meccan and Medina? Do you mean there's Jewish evidence in a surah identified by the Islamic tradition as Meccan? Or do you mean there's Jewish ideas and these ideas were present in Mecca itself? As everybody knows, the Quran contains no evidence for Mecca or Medina or for surahs belonging to either category. And so would it not be methodologically better to analyze the language of perhaps to talk about certain types of surahs or certain types of revelations in the Quran, certain stylistic types of revelation in the Quran, to make the connections that you want to make to Judaism, Christianity, and everything else, and then, if you want, to try to situate that in between the year 610 and 632. But why does one need to do that?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a very useful question, because it's a very useful kind of way of laying out one's commitments. I mean, I do think I should have probably said that, but I've written about that at some length, and like others, I mean, certainly not the first one. I do think it's true that you can sort of partition the Quran based on immanent stylistic criteria and based on content. So issues like verse length, phraseology, terminology, certain assumptions about God's punishment, and so on and so forth. I think a lot of those parameters converge in important ways. I mean, that's an idea that I get from Behnam Sadeghi, that such convergence is in fact something that requires an explanation. And if we just engage in typology at the moment, then I think the sound explanation in my mind would be that in the Quran we do in fact have different groups of surahs, and I think that's something that actually lots of people can agree on, whether they are more skeptically inclined or not. I mean, so I hinted at Tommaso; he certainly would agree that the what I would call the early Meccan surahs, which he might give a different name, can be sort of coherently kind of hived off as a relatively coherent, theologically and sort of terminologically, stylistically coherent subcorpus of the Quran. I think that's kind of the point of this recent edited volume that was mentioned initially, Unlocking the Medinan Quran. I also think that the Meccan versus Medinan distinction is one that you can sort of recapture imminently in terms of stylistic and sort of doctrinal features. Obviously, I think you've got an important point to make that, David, that one might not initially at least want to then use geographically laden terms like Mecca and Medina in order to sort of reflect that. So Mark Dury's book a couple of years ago talks about pre-transitional and post-transitional surahs, which is largely Meccan versus Medinan. But no, I mean, I think it's a useful sort of terminological movement on his part to actually separate it out from the geographical commitments that obviously immediately enter the picture once you say Meccan and Medinan. And I think it draws attention to the fact that actually the basic bipartition as such is sound. I think that there is a distinction to be made between two classes of texts in terms of the authority that is attributed to Muhammad, the understanding of how God's punishment will unfold in the world. I think he does an excellent job at sort of drawing that out. I would then take the additional step. I mean, I'm happy to then position these pre-transitional surahs in Mecca and the post-transitional ones in Medina, but that is an additional historiographic step that I think would need to be argued on its own terms. So I think it's you're right that that step of the argument, the initial taxonomic step of the argument, I think should probably be separated out more clearly. So I'd be open to that. I am then sort of at a secondary supplementary point happy to sort of bring in the basic scaffolding of the Islamic tradition as giving us probably the best account of Islamic origins that we have, if we don't want to sort of accrue terrible explanatory debts at other ends. But I completely recognize that others might legitimately differ there. But even if one sort of just kind of brackets what the Islamic sources tell us about Mecca as a place where supposedly you have at most individual Jews and Christians, I think there's still a striking contrast between sort of the specificity and the extent of rabbinic traditions, in particular in the pre-transitional and the post-transitional, the Meccan and the Medinan surahs. So for the Medinan ones, we get vocatives addressed to the Israelites, and we get sort of Arabic Hebrew punning. So it's clear that wherever those surahs were positioned, there must have been some engagement with local Jews. In the Meccan surahs, that is less visible. So we do have these slightly obscure references to Israelites, but the rabbinic material doesn't stare you in the face as much. And I guess the point of my talk was try to sort of recover places where there might nonetheless be rabbinic tradition. And I think a lot of that argument could still stand even without much Sirah stuff in the background. But I love talking the historicity of the Sirah, so it's good to be able to do that here.
Yes, please, Sean. Negative. There's 2
points. One, I'm very sympathetic with what you're trying to do. I think part of the problem is, especially when we're trying to reconstruct what we think is the intellectual context of the Qur'an, we tend to wear the lens of the sources that we're looking at the most. And I think this is happening now with a lot of Syriac material, which we're reading a lot of. A lot of it has not really been explored sufficiently. Like, I think that we're going to see a lot of Jacob of Sarug stuff coming out now, because we have this huge manuscript that was discovered of his and things like that, which is all great, right? And I just got done reviewing a great, brilliant monograph that makes a lot of the early Meccan stuff sound like it was written by a flunky from a monastery from the Church of the East. Maybe it was, right? But there's that certain effect. I think that there's a lot of material that does seem to be specifically rabbinic. The one that stood out to me that I have interest in is the polemics against sonship, which seems to me to be very specifically not just rabbinic, but highly attested in basically the Palestinian rabbinate, right? So, and one of the things that I wonder is how much should we pay attention to the geography of the materials that we're looking at? Should the Jerusalem Talmud be more, or in like Midrash Rabbah and things like that, be more important to us? Should we give it more weight than stuff that we find that might be particularly Babylonian or something like that? Part of the problem is us as Quranic studies people making a mess of doing that when we try to do that in the first place. And the other thing that I'll leave is Pharaoh is an interesting figure in the Quran in particular. I don't know of any source where Pharaoh claims to be God. That's late antique. And I was wondering if you've encountered things like that, or if that might be a Jewish theme as well.
Thank you. I think I'll just take that home, Frank. Sonship I'll have to think about. Maybe just to kind of echo what you said about geographical provenance. I mean, that's something that I think Holger's very much trying to do in the project that I'm actually also part of, and which is subsidizing my flight here, so I feel bound to say this. So can we sort of profile the traditions in the Quran? I mean, can we even profile it beyond rabbinic, into maybe Babylonian and Palestinian? So again, I was skeptical at first, but then I was really struck that the motif of patronage, divine patronage, it just doesn't come up in the Babylonian sources as far as I've been able to make out. I mean, it does seem to be distinctly Palestinian. So that did give me pause, yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Somebody said geographical context, so let's put into a social geographical context. Mecca and Medina surrounded by nomads. Just to take something from another context altogether, from the Eurasian steppe 1,000 or 2 before the time of Christ, our colleagues at Gidi Shelach, our colleague Gidi Shelach has shown that artistic motifs cross, not the objects themselves, artistic motifs are crossing from one end of the steppe to the other, 2,000 years, long before writing, of course. And so how does that exactly happen? We're not quite sure. It's evidently small chunks of people moving small distances, but one after another. Ideas can be transferred over long distances by nomadic peoples and perhaps other peoples too. And I think we should remember this is a very, very mobile, the Mecca and Medina are surrounded by mobile societies that reach all the way up to the top of the Syrian desert, in contact with Iraq and in contact with Palestine. And of course, then there's the merchants. Now, I don't know, in Gaza, there's a story, everybody knows that the great-grandfather of Hisham is supposedly buried there. I have no idea if he's really buried there or not. Nobody knows. But maybe the people in Gaza today know, but we don't know. But that's just a symbol of how people were moving around. And so nobody was going to Jerusalem for the one-year program, but I think people were moving, and these, therefore, ideas could be transferred. Christian and Jewish ideas of various types could be transferred, including the poetry that what we heard about before, the Palestinian Aramaic Jewish poetry that lasted up to the 7th century. So just some observations.
Thank you. So that raises the question, which I guess I haven't been fully explicit about, but it does sort of prey on me, kind of whether we've got sort of relay transmission at work here or direct transmission. So by relay transmission, when a sort of an Arabic gold coin is dug up in Britain, well, it seems unlikely that kind of an Umayyad vizier will have visited and dropped it there. It will have been passed on from one person to the next and so on and so forth. So there doesn't need to have been sort of direct interaction. There will have been sort of relay posts along the way. I think that could be true for a lot of the narratives that we find in the Quran, like the story about Abraham destroying the idols of his people. I mean, a good yarn travels. I don't think you need to have heard that from Jews who are also capable of reading Genesis Rabbah. But I guess in the instances that I've looked in my paper, so firstly we've got Quranic statements about Israelites on the ground, and then we've got, I guess, material that is relatively specific, more specific than narrative. So I wonder whether that then couldn't be an argument to saying, well, actually this is more than just relay transmission, which would always be my own default assumption. I'm always very happy to sort of invoke an amorphous oral tradition where things are just kind of floating around. But it seems to me in this case actually there's more concrete evidence for actual Jews being present in the place. So I wonder whether that argument stands. But yeah.
The only problem is, to the best of my knowledge, and I can be corrected, says that you...
No. No. Yeah, Arabia, but not, yeah, no, I mean, they're not, yeah.
I was just going to add to that. One thing I think is interesting is a lot of these narratives
do travel through artistic motifs and objects, like basically pilgrimage tokens, have like the Annunciation scene on there. What do we have in, like, also in Ampile and things like this? What do we have in the Quran? We have a narrative of the Annunciation scene, right? And one thing that is always really fascinating to me is, you know, how much of the not just, you know, the luxurious stuff that we see on like surviving synagogues and churches, but like the more humble ways in which these narratives travel in material media as well, not just through narrative.
Commentaries. Actually, only one commentary because I didn't have time to do more. But the commentators are in some embarrassment with this verse. On the one hand, they sometimes say that this was Abdullah ibn Salam, but they know that Abdullah ibn Salam was a man from Medina, not a man from Mecca. So some of them say it was Moses, Shahidun min Bani Israel. And this solves the problem very effectively. But in some cases, they consider this to be Abdullah ibn Salam and disregard completely his accepted biography that he was a man from Medina. Everybody knows that this is a Meccan verse. So the embarrassment is in the exegesis also. We don't know who was this witness.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think I'll be silent. There might be 2 or 3 more comments. I don't know whether we've got time for them. So if anybody else wants to speak, I'll gladly cede the floor.
Any other? Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much. I have just a short question. In the later sources, such as Gabri, do you think it is correct to translate as monotheists? For example, when they refer to the people of Mawara Nahr?
Right, yeah, no, I think that could be more of an argument that by the time it had become a word that effectively means... I don't mind polytheist as much as idolater. The reason why I mind idolater is because it kind of, with the translator's pen stroke, it seems to imply that obviously these people were worshipping objects. And but once you remove that, there's, I mean, again, this is just amplifying a point Patricia made. Actual sort of concrete worship of stone idols in the Quran always seems to happen in the past. It's, you know, mainly Abraham. It's not really in the present. So I don't think we can sort of infer from just the word mushrik, the presence of that word, what these people were actually doing cultically. But certainly by the time of Tabari, yeah, I mean, I think we've got a slightly sort of cliched, stereotypical representation of sort of pre-Islamic Arabian religion as being, you know, a bit preposterous and involving, you know, stone worship. So yes, so I wouldn't mark a student down for translating it as polytheist in a commentary. Yeah, important.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.